Control physical and logical access to assets. Purpose of identity and access management is the management of access to information, systems, devices, and facilities. Physical access or access to physical assets such as facilities, operational areas, and data centers. Logical access or access to computing assets such as operating systems, application programs, and networks. Subject is an active entity that accesses a passive object to receive information. Subjects can be users, programs, processes, services, computers, or anything else that can access a resource. Object is a passive entity that provides information to active subjects. Objects are files, databases, computers, programs, processes, services, printers, and storage media. Organization's information are all of its data. Control access to information are file and directory level permissions, database table, view, field, and row permissions. File and directory level permissions is managed at the operating system level or within a file sharing system. Database table, view, field, and row permissions managed within a database management system or a third-party tool. Systems are information technology, IT, systems that provide one or more services. Industrial control systems are remote monitoring control of utility infrastructure including electric power and distribution, water supplies, and sewage treatment. Devices are computing system, servers, desktop computers, portable laptop computers, tablets, smartphones, and external devices such as printers. Medical devices are equipment in hospitals such as patient monitoring and for pumps. Wearable device are watches, fitness devices, video glasses. Transportation devices are automobiles, self-driving cars, drones, satellites, GPS navigation, autopilots, air traffic control, and more. Controlling access to systems and devices are port-level access control, console login, remote console login, application programming interfaces, APIs. Port-level access control can be configured to accept incoming connection requests based upon their origin, such as IP address, IP network, or geographic region, as well as the port number. Console login is a physical or logical console controls access to the system generally based upon the proven identity of the subject who wants to connect. Remote console login is a system can be accessed via a remote console connection. Application programming interfaces, APIs, is a system or application can be accessed programmatically through an API that typically is used by an application that needs to access data or functions. Facilities are any physical location that it owns or rents. Controlling access to facilities are keycard access systems, escorts, guards and guard dogs, visitor logs, fences, walls, and gates, man traps and sally ports, bollards and crash gates. Keycard access systems control which persons are permitted to access. Visitors and subjects with lower security clearances may be escorted by other personnel. Guards and guard dogs ensure that only authorized personnel and properly escorted personnel are able to enter a building. Visitor logs provide a business record of guests and visitors who enter and leave a facility. Fences, walls, and gates help to establish a secure physical perimeter and controlled entry-exit points around a building or facility. Man traps and sally ports are combinations of passageways and entryways that restrict access to an area. Bollards and crash gates control vehicle flow. Manage identification and authentication of people, devices, and services. Identity and Access Management, IAM, is the management of identities, including people, devices, and services. To be able to access a resource, a user, device, or service must provide an identity. A person's identity is who they are. Identification is the process of verifying that a claimed identity is valid. For example, identification occurs when a person supplies a user ID and a system verifies that the user ID is valid. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a person or device. For example, when a person uses a user ID, they are required to provide their password to prove that they are the owner of that user ID. The final stage of the identity lifecycle is referred to as deprovisioning, disabling, revocation. Revocation means ending a person's general access to the system. For example, a bank member closed an account. Identity management implementation. Identity management techniques fall into two categories: centralized access controls, decentralized access controls. Centralized access control. Centralized access control authorization verification is performed by a single entity within a system. A small team or individual can manage centralized access control. In centralized access control, administrative overhead is lower because all changes are made in a single location, and a single change affects the entire system. Single sign-on, SSO, is a centralized access control technique that allows a user to be authenticated only once on a system and to access multiple resources without authenticating again. For example, users can authenticate once on a network and then access resources throughout the network without being prompted to authenticate again. The main advantage of single sign-on, SSO, is simplifies the process of gaining access to multiple systems for everyone. Decentralized access control are various entities located throughout a system perform authorization verification. Decentralized access control requires several teams or multiple entities. In decentralized access control, administrative cost is higher because changes must be implemented across several locations. The most difficult task is to maintain the different number of access control points. Single multi-factor authentication. Authentications is the process of proving that a person or system is who they claim to be. Authentication is based on three authentication factors: Type 1, Type 2, Type 3. Type 1 is something you know. For example, password. Type 2 is something you have. For example, smart card. Type 3 is something you are. For example, your fingerprint. Single-factor authentication requires only one of the three factors for authentication. Single-factor authentication are passwords, passphrase, one-time passwords, and personal identification numbers, PINs. Multi-factor authentication are two or more of something you know, something you have, and something you are combinations. Multi-factor authentication are tokens, certificates, and biometrics. Password, security question, tokens, biometrics. Password should be easy to remember but hard to guess. Password guidelines are complex, long, different, and non-obvious. Password should be complex. Compose passwords of letters, numbers, special characters, and symbols. Password should be long. 8 characters is a common minimum. Password should be different. Passwords should not be reused. Password should be non-obvious. For example, to avoid dictionary words. Security question is form of shared secret used as an authenticator. Tokens are electronic devices, small enough and light enough to be carried on a keychain, that display numeric sequences for authentication. Biometrics are biological measurements that can be used to identify individuals. Fingerprint mapping, facial recognition, and retina scans are all forms of biometric technology. Two types of biometric methods are Type 1 and Type 2. Type 1 is false rejection, failure to recognize a legitimate user. Type 2 is false acceptance, by accepting an imposter as a legitimate user. Accountability. Accountability allows individuals and processes to be held responsible for their actions and decisions. Accountability ensures that only authorized users are accessing the system and using it properly. Audit trails and system logs are components of accountability. IT audit is the process of collecting and evaluating evidence of information systems. Audit trail is a security-relevant set of records that provide documentary evidence of the activities. System log file contains events that are logged by the operating system components. Accounting in AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting services records what a subject did. Session management. Session is an agreement between two parties to communicate interactively. Session management is the process of securing multiple requests to a service from the same user. Session management is the process of establishing, controlling, and terminating sessions. Session establishment are authentication and authorization of one or both endpoints. Controlling session can involve logging the start and end and anything in between. Session termination terminates all processes associated with a user's logical session. Three triggers for session termination are timeout, inactivity, and anomaly. Timeout is the endpoints typically agree on how long they will last. Session inactivity are used to detect abandoned sessions and free server resources by deleting those sessions. Session anomaly detection is an additional control added to a session that is triggered by timeouts or inactivity or both. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, and Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, HTTPS, are conducted statelessly. Statelessly means that each request to a web server for information is handled with no knowledge of previous requests. Session ID is a unique number that a website's server assigns a specific user for the duration of that user's visit. Session ID will typically expire after a set period. For example, an hour or a day. One common goal of attackers is to corrupt the state kept by the session manager. Session hijacking is allowing an attacker to act in the stead of the authenticated user. Session sidejacking can be accomplished by eavesdropping technique to intercept and study the traffic between the two sides. Session fixation can be used in cases where the value of a session ID is known and fixed. Registration and proofing of identity. Identity and access management systems. Users must register and provide proof of their identity. Registration and proof of identity process involves collecting and verifying information about the person who he or she claims to be. The most basic method of proof of identity is providing a driver's license, passport, or some other government-issued identification. NIST Special Publication 800-63A, Digital Identity Guidelines. Enrollment and identity proofing requirement is responsible for advising federal agencies of registration and identity proofing. Digital Identity Guidelines. Enrollment and identity proofing requirements are 3 identity assurance levels, EALs. At risk level 1, service provider can take self-asserted attributes from the claimant. At risk level 2 require evidence that supports the real-world existence of the claimed identity and then use that evidence to verify that the claimant has a right to that identity. The evidence could be a state-supplied driver's license, for instance, or a certified copy of a birth certificate. At risk level 3 require the physical presence of the claimant. For example, biometric attributes. Federated identity management. Federation, a group of states with a central government but independence in internal affairs. In information technology, federation is a group of computing or network providers agreeing upon standards of operation in a collective fashion. For example, Yahoo and Microsoft announced that Yahoo Messenger and MSN Messenger would be interoperable. Federated identity is a portable identity, and its associated rights can be used across business boundaries. Federated identity allows a user to be authenticated across multiple IT systems and enterprises. Identity management is the management of user identities and their credentials. Federated identity management is a form of single sign-on, SSO, that meets the solutions for users accessing resources over the Internet. Multiple organizations can join a federation where they agree on a method to share identities between them. Users in each organization can log on once in their own organization, and their credentials are matched with federated identity. They can then use this federated identity to access resources in any other organization within the group. Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML, is an open standard for exchanging identity and security information with applications and service providers. Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML, roles are: Identity Provider, Service Provider, Subject or Principal. Four components of SAML are: Assumptions, Bindings, Protocols, Profiles. Credential Management Systems. Credential management systems enable an organization to centrally organize and control user IDs and passwords for users. Credential management systems can help harden user credentials. Password managers are example of a credential management system. Commercial Credential Management System, CMS, to create, maintain, and store traditional passwords, digital certificates and tokens, one-time passwords, biometric records. Guidelines of Credential Management System, CMS. Use strong passwords. Automatically generate complex passwords. Implement password history. Use access control mechanisms, including the who, what, how, and when of access. Implement auditing. Implement backup and restore mechanisms for data integrity. Implement redundant systems within the credential management systems to ensure 24/7/365 access. Implement credential management group policies or other mechanisms offered by operating systems. Commercial Credential Management System, CMS, scale well as the enterprise or federation grows. Commercial Credential Management System, CMS, handle the needs of devices and users who are on-site, remote, mobile, or in the cloud. Integrate identity as a third-party service. Service providers provide to identification services. There are two basic approaches to architecting identity services, in-house or outsourced. In-house, all the systems and data are located within the organization. In an outsourced model, most or all of the systems or data will be hosted by an external party. Integrate identity as a third-party service. Three scenarios are on-premises implementations, cloud services, and a federated approach. On-premise system is one in which all needed resources remain under own company physical control. In the cloud, organization and using an identity from an outside provider, such as Google, Facebook, or Amazon Web Services. Federated group of partners will need to examine the increased spread of the risks involved. Implement and manage authorization mechanisms. Authorization defines the rights and permissions granted to a user account or process. Authorization mechanisms determine how subjects access objects. Authorization mechanisms models are Role-Based Access Control, RBAC. Rule-Based Access Control. Mandatory Access Control, MAC. Discretionary Access Control, DAC, and Attribute-Based Access Control, ABAC. Role-Based Access Control, RBAC, is an access control model that is based on how information is accessed on a system based on the role of the subject. For example, bank may have loan officers, tellers, and managers. Administrators can create a group named loan officers, and then assign appropriate privileges to the group. Rule-based access control is an access control model that is based on a list of predefined rules that determine what accesses should be granted. For example, firewall is a set of rules or filters defined by an administrator. Mandatory access control, MAC, is an access control model that is based on a subject's clearance and an object's labels. For example, subjects and objects have clearances and labels are confidential, secret, and top secret. Discretionary access control, DAC, is an access control model that is based on data owners decide who has access to resources. For example, manager for a IT department might be made the data owner of the files and resources within his department. Attribute-based access control, ABAC, is an access control model that is based on an access policy determined by the attributes of a subject and object. For example, access to a given data set or system might only be allowed during working hours. Manage the identity and access provisioning lifecycle. The identity lifecycle are identity creation, identification, authentication, authorization, and deprovisioning. These steps can be generalized as provisioning, reviewing, and deprovisioning of identification. Access request is a formal request to access specific data or a specific role in a system. Request review is reviewed by a designated person or group. User and system account access review should be reviewed on a regular basis. Ensuring that activate accounts are used only by the authorized users and inactive accounts are disabled and employees do not have excessive privileges. Provisioning manages the creation, modification, and revocation of user accounts according to defined security policies. Deprovisioning is the act of removal or disabling the user account.